Thank you all for coming, and thank you to History House for having me. Ellen Thomson, beyond a reasonable doubt. There she is, what she looks like. It's her official police photograph. There is only one, and it's what one could call her mugshot. The reason for the hands above and below are to prove that she has 10 fingers. This is at a time when there was no such thing as fingerprinting, and by way of identification, you had to prove the person had 10 fingers. Okay? So it does look a little bit gruesome to us. She's wearing widow's mourning at the time, which happened to be her best dress. And she wore it to his funeral, she wore it to the trial, and she wore it to be executed in. This is Brisbane Jail, also known as Boggo Road Jail, where shortly before 8 a.m. on the morning of Monday the 13th of June 1887, a small official party left a disused hospital block in the grounds of the jail. The party included the principal jailer, Captain John Jekyll, various warders, a priest and 2 sisters of mercy. In the centre was a prisoner, a tiny woman, 4 feet 9 inches in height. As the group crossed the yard, a strong wind blew back her black bonnet to reveal a face that was pale and drawn and looked older than her 41 years. Male hangings were not uncommon, but this was the first time a woman was to be executed in the colony of Queensland, and the prison authorities were anxious for everything to go smoothly. The prisoner had been restless of late, even at times violent, and the gentlemen of the press were hoping for some incident, anything that would help sell newspapers. This is a map of North Queensland showing there's Cairns, there's Port Douglas, 10 miles north is Mossman, and his property selection was about 10 miles inland. That's a map of the selection there. It's not very clear, but you can see the river goes around there. I first became aware of Ellen Thomson while on holiday in Port Douglas. Some of you will know Port Douglas as a holiday resort with its population of 5,000 that almost doubles in the holiday season. But when gold was discovered on the Hodgkinson River in 1876, it was little more than a tent settlement. There, in 1877, Ellen Wood, a widow, went with her 4 children from Cooktown in search of work. Douglas was the port for a fledgling settlement in the grip of gold fever, with thousands of diggers arriving, many of them Chinese. Whole families came with mattresses, bedsteads and tables, even sewing machines, which piled up on the jetty waiting for bullock trains to take them inland to the diggings. Some loads required as many as 20 bullocks to haul them up the bump, a hill south of Port Douglas that was so steep coaches were forced to stop halfway and the women were asked to get out and walk, and the men were asked to help push the load to the top. This is Port Douglas in 1885, 9 years later. By then it had become a flourishing township with its own newspaper, churches, banks and several pubs, all of which had moved out of canvas into more durable weatherboard buildings. This was what the township looked like when a year later a murder was committed about 10 miles north. Now the facts of the case were these. In 1886, William Thomson, a 66-year-old farmer, was murdered on his selection on the Mossman River. The murderer was a farm labourer, John Harrison, aged 27, and his accomplice was the victim's wife, Ellen, who had married Thomson in 1880. Thomson was 22 years older than Ellen and Harrison 17 years younger. The pair were arrested on the 6th of January 1887, tried and executed with almost indecent haste less than 6 months later. So I started by reading newspaper reports of the trial on microfilm. Tracking down information can lead one in many different directions, and writing for children, I have over the years consulted vets, pathologists, park rangers, government departments, museum curators, mining experts and lawyers, among others. I have clambered over replicas of the ships Endeavour and Batavia and watched racehorses training at Brandwick at 4 in the morning. I've also read letters, journals, ship's logs, studied maps and slogged my way through many years of the Herald and other newspapers on microfilm. But when writing historical fiction, it's customary, if you can't find something out, to make an educated guess to fill the gap. So for the novel, I tried to imagine what sort of legitimate work a widow with children to support would have been able to find in a gold mining town. Given the number of hotels in existence, I thought it probably was a barmaid. So I wrote to a beer museum asking about pubs in the 1870s. I also knew she'd been visited by the Sisters of Mercy in her final weeks in prison, so I wrote to the archives of their order with other questions. I looked at census records, birth, death, marriage and execution certificates, they do exist, for details of the story. At one stage I thought William might have been a bigamist. At another, I thought I'd track down John Harrison's family to a mining village in the north of England where all his brothers and cousins had gone down the pit. As for practical research, years ago I had seen the scaffold and condemned cell in Old Melbourne Jail where Ned Kelly was held and executed in 1880. I later inspected the scaffold and hospital block in Fremantle Jail. That is the scaffold in Fremantle Jail. And you notice the chair, that is in case the prisoner about to be strung up feels faint. It was okay that if you felt faint or thought you wouldn't be able to keep your knees from shaking, it was okay to sit down and they'd still string you up anyway. Yeah, so that's the scaffolding. Since jails at the time were designed by government architects, they tended to follow the same basic plan. So I figured this was probably very similar to the one that executed Ellen. They also had all the rafters painted black, which is a bit gruesome, and I think there were also 13 steps up. I think that's traditional. I also contacted the jail museum for the formula used to hang criminals in the 19th century, and in order to get a sense of the cramped conditions in a cell measuring 7 feet by 4, that's the game one in Fremantle Jail, I marked out the area in masking tape on the floor beside my desk. When visitors asked why there was masking tape on the carpet, my kids would say, "Oh, that's just Mother's condemned cell." When I thought I'd covered all the facts, I showed the novel to a freelance editor whose advice was, throw away all the history and just write the story. And I was horrified. I remember saying, I can't do that, this woman was hanged. It wasn't fair to Ellen to alter history for the sake of a good yarn, but to do her justice, so to speak, I realised I'd have to discard the novel idea in favour of a non-fiction book that placed her in her social context and the times in which she lived. That meant starting all over again. When Ellen lived there, far north Queensland was a place of hard workers and hard drinkers. It was also a place undergoing rapid change. Men who had made it on the goldfields came back and took up selections, thereby displacing Aboriginal groups. Now, you see where the W.H. Buchanan is there? He was William Thomson's neighbour, but the river goes down, so William's block was below Buchanan's, but they actually shared a creek. That was the boundary between their properties, thereby displacing Aboriginal groups. This resulted in a series of retaliation killings on both sides, but by 1887 the Aborigines had been reduced to receiving government handouts of blankets and tobacco. As the selectors' fortunes grew, they built bigger and grander homesteads, and many also owned hotels or businesses in town. Hard-working Chinese diggers who had struggled to extract gold from claims others had abandoned, only to send it back to China, now became tenants and market gardeners on land owned by white settlers. The Chinese population numbered 2/3 that of the white population in the district, and the resentment of settlers towards them and towards the South Sea Islanders who'd been brought in to work in the cane fields became the basis of the White Australia policy, introduced in 1901. So it was a very racist area, and one can't help thinking that the Chinese witnesses who came forward might have been thinking that perhaps in doing so this might have improved their lot. Having decided to go down the non-fiction path, I was lucky to find 2 family historians who'd also been researching Ellen. It now seemed that her descendants no longer rejected her. One researcher was able to clarify the order of the children's births and to provide me with their full names, which was useful since the newspapers seemed confused both as to their ages and they often use nicknames for them. Another family historian lives in a neighbouring suburb. So we were able to meet and discuss differences in our research. For instance, I found that her age had been incorrectly recorded when she first arrived as a child from Ireland. This made her not 41 when she was executed, but 44. He knew something of her early life before she moved from New South Wales to Queensland, and that she'd worked as a washerwoman in Cooktown and Port Douglas before becoming William's housekeeper and later his wife. This meant all the barmaid bits had to go, along with the beer taps on the polished brass foot rails. I'd enjoyed that bit. Not to mention large slabs of dialogue which I had used to flesh out the characters. I had William and Ellen meet in a pub, and later William meeting Harrison in a pub. It seemed logical. Losing these scenes was a downside, but the upside was getting to see more original documents. For instance, I thought I'd read all the Crown depositions, but the researcher I'd employed in Brisbane, who was another fiction writer, had only selected what she thought would make a good novel. So I contacted Queensland State Archives and asked if they had anything else on Ellen Thomson, and back came the reply, yes, they have a 300-page digital file. Would I like to see it? I paid $300 and had it emailed to me, then downloaded all the documents and slowly worked my way through them. This is one of the documents. You can see how hard they are to read. Many times you resort to a magnifying glass. This is the Townsville jail list of April 1877. She was held, or both of them were held in Townsville jail because that's where the court was, where they were going to be tried. She is there, and John Harrison is there. Reading along, it says, Harrison, 27, came from England, Church of England, labourer, came out on Timor, 1887. That's wrong. He jumped ship from the HMS Myrmidon, 1885. So you can't always believe these things as being absolutely true. Ellen is listed as 41, from Ireland, Roman Catholic, housewife, came out on the Lord Ashby, 1873. She didn't. She came out in the Joshua in 1858. Many depositions were duplicates of those I'd already read, but the police magistrate's inquiry had taken place over a number of days, and some witnesses were recalled to provide fuller depositions, which meant there was something sometimes extra detailed. The file also contained notes made by the judge during the trial and a solicitor's letter sent on behalf of the victim's brother, Thomas Thomson, requesting that the body of William be exhumed and an autopsy performed. The letter also referred to Ellen Thomson as a loose woman and to John Harrison as her latest fancy man, which phrases seem to have prejudiced Justice Cooper from the start. Again, I thought I had everything covered when I received an unexpected phone call from Queensland State Archives, who I must say were very helpful, saying the good news was they'd found the plan of the house I was looking for, which had been one of the exhibits in the trial, but the bad news was they'd found it by accident in another 300-page file they didn't know they had. But it hadn't been digitally copied, so it was only available in hard copy. Would I like to fly to Queensland to read it? I weighed up the cost of airfares and accommodation and opted to have the whole lot photocopied and posted to him. This is the state of some of it. You can see how Queensland bugs or rats or mould or whatever have done their worst. Fortunately, that wasn't a vitally important one. So another $300, but at least I could go through it at leisure and compare it to the first file. And again, there was a lot of repetition, but a few depositions I hadn't seen, and this file included the warrants for their arrest and Ellen's and Harrison's final statements in prison. What made the case interesting for me, apart from the fact that she was the only woman ever hanged in Queensland, were the ambiguities and inconsistencies surrounding the case. This, believe it or not, is Townsville Supreme Court at the time. In the 1890s, they built a much fancier building. It was 2 stories with grand verandas around it, and in the early 1900s, it was expanded again. And that's what was there in the 1870s and 80s. The trial was held in Townsville Supreme Court in early May of 1887. As I read the newspaper reports, I could sense Ellen's growing desperation in the courtroom and Justice Cooper's thinly veiled contempt, as well as his extraordinary handling of the case. Even hard-nosed reporters wondered what had happened to the principle of innocent until proved guilty, when he instructed the jury thus: in every case of murder, the law assumes that murder has been committed until the contrary is proven. At the same time, his notes made during the trial leave no doubt as to his opinion. He wrote, "They were tried before Justice Cooper. The evidence left no room for doubt as to their guilt. And yet for some strange reason, these lines have been crossed out. So maybe they were written a little too early, perhaps before the jury had retired to consider its verdict." His prejudicial approach allowed the evidence of an ex-prisoner who had left the prison before Harrison was admitted and was in fact rearrested during the trial for larceny. And Justice Cooper also accepted the evidence of Chinese witnesses saying they are an observant race when their evidence seemed largely repetitive, even hinting at collusion. As if this weren't enough of an obstacle, the law at the time did not permit the accused to mount a defence or call witnesses on their behalf, nor were they allowed to take the stand during a trial, and were only allowed to cross-examine Crown witnesses. Modern laws of evidence allow accused persons to defend themselves far more vigorously. Justice Cooper. He was born Pope Alexander Cooper. Anyone who calls their child as a first name Pope obviously has an Pope Alexander Cooper, near Lake George in New South Wales, and educated at Sydney Grammar School, then later in England. On his return to Australia in 1874, he entered the public service in Queensland, advancing to Crown Prosecutor in the Northern District Supreme Court in 1878. He was appointed Attorney General during a brief stint in politics, and then in 1883 was assigned to the Northern Bench of the Supreme Court. His judicial style was described as grand, pompous and arrogant, and he was noted for his severity in criminal cases. At the time of the trial, it was reported in the press that His Honour was engaged in a dispute with Queensland Treasury because he had exceeded his judicial allowance, spending considerable sums of money on French champagne. His response was, having to do the Northern Circuit, he regarded as a hardship, and he therefore considered himself entitled to his lifestyle. The set of notes he made during the trial was reworked for his official report. They start off by saying, despite evidence to the contrary, that Ellen had lived a happy life with her husband until a younger man appeared on the scene. This suggests he had already made up his mind. When he asked the accused if they had anything to say before sentencing, Harrison remained silent. But Ellen, he said, launched forth into an impassioned oration which for a time stupefied the people in the courtroom. His Honour had no choice but to hear her out. She started by describing her early life and later as William's wife. She then tried to exonerate herself by suggesting a number of possible reasons for his death, somehow managing to tie herself in knots in the process, which only made her appear more guilty. Justice Cooper referred to this trail of confusion in his notes. Given His Honour had already performed his legal duty in sentencing them, it is interesting that the notes also included passages which he must have taken from later newspaper reports describing her death, and I quote, "The next moment she was gone. Her body dangled lifeless, and a crimson stream poured over her dress onto the floor. In her hand she still clutched the little crucifix, by this time steeped in blood. This smacks not only of the ghoulish, but goes well beyond words one would expect from an impartial judge." But if he had little sympathy for Ellen, he perhaps had slightly more for Harrison, because he described him on the morning of the execution in these words. "He gazed steadily through the iron-barred windows at the far sun of the jail building, as though regretting that the sunshine beyond was so gone and so rudely to be closed from his sight forever." Since he would not have been present in the jail that morning, this can only be dismissed as poetic licence on his part. Appearing for the Crown was Mr. Virgil Power. Appointed Crown Prosecutor to the Sussex Court in 1882, he was later to be elevated to the Supreme Court bench. He was regarded as practical, brilliant and a witty advocate. Opposing him was Mr. Lew, a Swiss lawyer and partner in the firm of Roberts and Lew, solicitors, Townsville. He clearly felt inadequate for the job, even apologising to the jury for his lack of experience in such cases. Thomson and Harrison were not served well by their counsel. The barrage of depositions seemed endless, and Ellen's attempt to cross-examine witnesses of the Crown tended to make matters worse. The victim, William Thomson, was portrayed in the press and in court as vulnerable and helpless at the hands of the accused, even though there was some evidence to suggest he was an alcoholic, paranoid, and held strong racist views. He openly admitted to hating the Chinese, yet he had Chinese tenants on his land, but he felt they were out to destroy him by producing crops on land where he had failed. During the trial, a number of witnesses made a point of saying he was sober on the day of his death, which seemed an odd thing to stress unless the opposite tended to be the norm. 3 years before the murder, he had consulted a doctor for tumour of the liver, which suggests some form of swelling that may have been alcohol-related. William was also violent at times, having on one occasion thrown a knife at Ellen and a kerosene lamp at his stepdaughter. Far from being a good stepfather, he had over the years effectively driven all of her children away, leaving only the youngest, 8-year-old Helen, whom he initially believed to be his, although he later changed his mind and turned against her, even to the point of altering his will to exclude her. Ellen was known to be hard-working, gregarious, perhaps flirtatious, but at the same time a devoted mother with a strong sense of justice. She was always also someone restricted by a lack of education, since she could neither read nor write. This had no doubt prompted her to ride out with other women in the community to meet the governor when he passed through the district, hoping to persuade him to provide a school for their children. John Harrison, the murderer. He was a farm labourer, but he was also a deserter from the Royal Navy, who shortly after he jumped ship in 1885 had headed north to the Daintree looking for work. I might also say that he jumped ship in September of 1885 and he married a woman 8 years his senior in December of 1885. And there was a price on his head when he headed to the Daintree, and it was his wife who dobbed him in when she heard about his being involved with Ellen. When the murder was committed, he and Ellen had known each other barely 2 months. This hardly suggests to me a grand passion. He appears to have been strong-minded, selfish, and out for what he could get from life and prepared to grab any opportunity. This is Ellen Thomson's charge card. This is what they would have written out when she was admitted into Boggo Road Jail. It describes her there, her colouring, grey hair, grey eyes, etc., sentence of death, and then the remarks are written down at the end. You can read them: strenuously denied her guilt on the gallows, etc. And it's again that same official photograph, although she tends to look a bit younger in that, but only because it's a dark photograph. In the 19th century, a woman who broke the mould of docile and obedient, whether she be wife, mother or daughter, was considered abnormal. It was hardly surprising, therefore, that the press seemed keen to portray Ellen as a scarlet woman. They referred to the number of her children, but failed to mention that she was a widow, thereby implying that they were all illegitimate, possibly even from different fathers. The papers also printed rumours that Ellen, being much older than Harrison, had most probably led him astray, even that he might have been a bit simple to have been prepared to do her bidding in killing her husband. A wife who murdered her husband, whatever the circumstances, was deemed a monster, many times worse than her male counterpart. So after William's death, the community was quick to overlook his shortcomings and to point the finger at his long-suffering widow. The case is interesting not for any legal precedent, but in part because the evidence does not appear to support guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. There were enough inconsistencies, one would have thought, make a jury uncertain as to their verdict. For example, the doctor's original report of suicide when he examined the body was changed after the autopsy to murder, and yet the autopsy raised other questions, such as, did the bullet split in two? And when 2 other doctors were called in to corroborate the cause of death, their opinions differed slightly. Then just before sentence was passed, an odd thing happened. As an example of the public's discomfort at the thought of hanging a woman, a lone juror stood and asked to address the bench. He was speaking only for himself, he said, and he believed them to be guilty, but he wished to plead for clemency from the bench on behalf of the female prisoner, on the basis that she had endured a very hard life. The judge's notes refer to this request as clemency for both prisoners, but the newspapers claimed the juror was pleading only for Ellen. It could be argued, why shouldn't a woman found guilty of murder receive the same penalty as a man? But even though her community had turned against her, there were still some sections of the public that struggled with the notion of executing a woman. Many people, even the hangman, thought she'd be reprieved at the 11th hour. There she was again. In the week leading up to her execution, Mr. J.W. Knight, the harbour master and customs official of Port Douglas, wrote 2 open letters to the press, hoping to gain some public sympathy for her. He said he had known her in Cooktown and described her as hard-working and kind, and he appealed to the women of Queensland to get behind her and show their support in not seeing one of their own sex hanged. The editor printed the letters, but with a terse footnote saying that in his opinion she deserved to hang. Ellen probably knew nothing of these letters, and it is unlikely she would have been aware that in the same week a group of prominent Brisbane businessmen, none of whom had met her, sent a telegram to the Governor asking for her sentence to be commuted to life imprisonment. His Excellency replied that it was too late in the proceedings and the execution was to go ahead as planned. Was she guilty? She may well have been an accessory before and or after the fact. Whose idea was it? Hard to say. They did not know that William had changed his will, and both assumed Ellen would be left the property. She admitted before she died that she thought she and Harrison could have managed it between them. As for the so-called affair, both said they didn't love the other, so it appears to have been a case of proximity and convenience rather than anything stronger. Harrison once declared that he had done away with better men than William, but in his final confession he said that he goaded William into killing himself, and a struggle had ensued and he had turned the gunner out and made him fire. He said Ellen took no part in the murder, but she was in on the plan. She, however, could not understand, not having pulled the trigger herself, how she could possibly be guilty of murder, and she went to her death protesting her innocence. Did she have a fair trial? By today's standards, no. But even at the time, with a hanging judge who was clearly biased, a clever Crown Counsel and 197 depositions on one side, and an inexperienced country solicitor and no witnesses on the other, it's easy to see which way the scales would fall. Certainly with today's laws of evidence and a smart lawyer, a jury might have been unable to deliver a verdict of guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Initially, Ellen could only mark documents with her X, but in time she learnt to write her name. Her writing started off boldly on statements she signed soon after her arrest, even to little flourishes on the capital E and little tails and things like that. But as the execution date drew nearer, you can see the gradual deterioration in the letters until her signature ends up as little more than a shaky scrawl. On the morning of the hanging, if the gentlemen of the press were hoping for bad behaviour on the part of the female prisoner, they were disappointed. She gave the authorities no trouble. But for a touch of drama, they did not have to wait long. Ellen proved too small to fit the scale used to calculate hangings, with the result that the execution went terribly wrong, and those forced to witness it were horrified. Soon after, having made a mess of one hanging, the executioner overcompensated when hanging Harrison, with the same ghastly result. Once they had been cut down, both suffered the further indignity of having their skulls examined by a professor of phrenology, who seemed keen to prove avarice on the part of Harrison and an overdeveloped sexual appetite on the part of Ellen, thus perpetuating the image of Scarlet Woman. Whatever people may have thought of her in the past, a number of her descendants and supporters are now keen to find out more about her. Some have gone so far as to seek not a posthumous pardon, since they acknowledge her likely guilt, but a retrospective forgiveness on the basis that the trial was patently unfair. They have written to the Queen, who has replied that as a constitutional monarch she cannot interfere, and the Governor-General has referred the matter to the Governor of Queensland, who has refused on legal advice. But Ellen could claim one victory at least. Before she died, she asked the prison chaplain and Mr. Knight, the harbour master, to take care of her children, in particular the youngest, Helen. After her mother's death, Nellie, as she was more commonly known, became the subject of a custody battle between the priest and the acting land commissioner, Richard Owen Jones, whom some said was the child's biological father. Unfortunately, the jury is still out on that because Ellen both admitted and denied the child's paternity on different occasions, and there is no proof either way. In the end, the court ruled in favour of Ellen, and her wish that the child be sent to a convent and brought up in the Catholic faith, was honoured. Although Ellen's life was cut short at 44, her daughter Helen lived to the grand old age of 93. Thomas Thomson, the brother who inherited William's property along with his debts, paid for an elaborate headstone to be erected in William's memory. Ellen Thomson and John Harrison remain to this day in unmarked graves in a South Brisbane cemetery. Thank you.
I might ask, does anyone have any questions? And if so, I might have to bring the microphone.
Nothing too difficult and legal.
How long from the moment you began to research till you finished the book did you take?
Well, I first heard about Ellen in 1993, and after many drafts of a novel and doing other things in the meantime, it was only this year that I finally sent in the final. And I have to read it back. It's coming back with some questions on it. I mean, it hasn't been all the time. It's been on and off, but over a long period. It's 10 years.
So who's publishing it for you?
Halstead Press.
It's not to do with the thing, but the person who wrote out the document of her guilt and hanging and thing, American, because it's spelled grey. Her hair is spelled the American way.
A-Y. Yeah. I think it's only because at that time spellings varied slightly. You find them in surnames. You find labourer spelled L-A-B-O-R-E-R instead of O-U-R, things like that, and there were several variations. I think it's just that spelling hadn't completely settled down and become official.
On her prison card, it actually said she died instantaneously at the bottom. How
Well-
long did it actually take her to die?
It was instantaneous. The doctors who were present at the hanging, they had to have two, one to write out the certificate and one to witness the body, and that both said that it cut the medulla oblongata and the death would have been instantaneous for both her and Harrison. It was just horrendous for people to see.
So what was the thing about the judge commenting on all the blood? Was that just
Well,
not true?
because it cut the
The
jugular and the blood came down, but she would already have been dead. And the same for Harrison.
I was just going to ask you to clarify why it went wrong. Yes.
Oh, why it went wrong?
Because it's cut.
Well, as I said, she didn't meet the scale. I mean, the scale was
What was
aimed.
the effect? I mean, and it's the
Oh.
cut jugular. That's
Yes, it cut the jugular. And the scale goes on the basis of men of a certain height, men of a certain weight. It works on the difference of the rope, the length of the rope, the amount of the drop, and in that particular scaffold picture I showed, there was a huge sandbag that was used before any execution to test the rope and that it would hold, and it was something like 4 strands of Indian hemp for a woman, the executioner decided, and 5 for a man, because he had a heavier weight, but she was way down below the scales, and he was just guessing this is what would work. And then Harrison, who was about 5'9", he went completely the other way, trying desperately to make sure. I might add that a lot of hangings do go wrong, apparently.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the Chinese witnesses? It would appear that they were probably found guilty because there were witnesses to it. What was
They
the
were
circumstance? Where did it happen? How
Well,
they happened
a
to
lot
be
of
there?
their comments were, I see Mr. Harrison, Mr. Thomson that day, him sober. You know, I mean, their English was limited, and this is what was actually recorded, you know, him sober. I see him coming back, you know, I hear 2 shots. They all were all adamant that there had been 2 shots, and she kept saying there was only 1 shot because she was trying to push the idea of the suicide in 1 shot. I think it's pretty clear that if he didn't use another gun, that he turned around and, used the same gun twice.
But there was no Chinese witness to the event.
Oh no,
It was all
no
circumstantial.
witnesses to the actual event. A neighbour who lived half a mile away, who didn't hear any gunshots that night, was the one who actually came in and looked at the body. The Chinese only said they heard the shots, and the next day they may have seen the body or something like that. But their evidence really did sound a bit rehearsed. The fact that they were all trying to say that he was sober, that they all heard 2 shots. One of them said that he'd gone up to the house and he'd seen the pair dancing in the dining room, which was the one living area. And then in his later deposition, he says he saw them on a bed. This was not in the first deposition, in the second deposition. And when Ellen went into Townsville jail and wrote out her statement, it said that the Detective Inspector Morrison said, "I'll get you, old woman, even if I have to pay a Chinaman £100 to say it." But they all had to sign a statement, all the witnesses, saying that they would be liable for £40 if their evidence proved false. But, you know, you don't know whether money passed hands or not. And it was in the best interests of the Chinese, I'm not knocking them, to step forward and say, look, we're doing our civic duty by getting involved in this case, because they could only be treated better in the community, I guess, but I don't know.
If she was the only woman hanged, and presumably there were other women who had committed murders, etc., would it have been that horrific case that stopped other people hanging her? Did hanging stop? What's the historical reason that she was the only one?
There were 3 women who, I think it was 3, who were charged with murder and were condemned to death, but their sentences were reprieved at the last minute to life imprisonment. I think the last was sometime in the 1920s or something, but they were reprieved.
So it had nothing to do with this case?
No, Ellen was reprieved.
These were all after Ellen.
There was one round about the same time or shortly after, but there were only about 3 all told.
Actually, the shooting of Thomson, is there any possibility whatsoever that it could have been suicide?
Well, that's what they were playing on, because he'd obviously been depressed and his health was poor and he frequently talked about suicide, and that's what they were hoping to convince people of. But I don't think it was in the end. I think it was too plain.
How many bullet wounds did he have?
He had 2 bullets in his skull, but the defence lawyer said, look, according to Taylor's medical jurisprudence, a bullet can split inside a skull, and how can you be sure that it's definitely the one? And he went to the jury on that basis. But there was some talk as to whether another gun had been used. Harrison didn't have another gun, but he had injured his hand not long beforehand with a gun belonging to the victim. For some reason it had been lent him. And his hand was damaged and he wasn't able to continue with his work, which he was doing, which was on a snagging party on the Mossman River, that is, removing all the weeds and the debris that's blocking the ships going down.
If they had decided to kill him, surely they would know that they'd get caught, because they hadn't tried burying the body or getting rid of the body or even making an excuse.
Oh no, but they had this elaborate sort of story that, you know,
That
he
killed
had
himself.
gone off to work at a mill 7 miles inland, and it was too dark, he couldn't get there, he'd come back and she turned up at the neighbour's house saying, oh, I wish Jack hadn't gone to 7 Mile, and the man with him said, no, he hasn't, he's here now. So there was a lot of that sort of thing, but it definitely looked as if she knew what they had planned.
I was interested to know a little more about Ellen's early life, how she got to be in Cooktown.
She had come out from Ireland as a child of supposedly 11 with her 9-year-old sister, but being very small, and the sister was also small, I suspected that she was in fact 14 and the sister was 12, because her mother, who was a widow, would have had to pay £2 for a child. With a child of 12, you would have paid the adult fare out, which was something like £12, and for an impoverished widow from Ireland, it would have been quite a bit. So they came out then, they went down to stay with a relative in Goulburn, working as a housekeeper with her children, probably as skivvies. And Ellen had married at a young age, something like 19, and had something like 5 children in quick succession, one of whom died at the age of 4 of scarlet fever, and a son was brought up by an aunt when his father died. His father was a boundary rider and fencer, and was presumably killed in a fall from a horse. And so Ellen then decided to go north to Cooktown, looking for work, thinking obviously there'll be men up there, they'll need their washing done, I might even get another husband, and I'm going to find work up there, it's going to be easier than
It's
down
an
in the
enormous distance
country.
to go.
Distance to go from here.
And was that, do you think, because of the gold rushes?
I think
that
it
she'd
was, yes,
perhaps
would have
heard
been
of it?
around about the 70s that she heard it. And gold, of course, was found in Cooktown
Yeah.
before it was found on the Hodgkins.
Sorry, where was it found subsequently, Cooktown and?
Well, we're near Port Douglas, which is the Hodgkins River. But the Palmer River and all of those areas up there had gold. And it was just a very wealthy, at the time, Charters Towers Stock Exchange was one of the wealthiest in the world.
And you're looking at in
Oh,
August?
yes, the moment the title is still Ellen Thomson, Beyond a Reasonable Doubt. It's being published by Halstead Press and hopefully it will come out in August of this year. And if you were interested in copies, you could contact Halstead Press directly or me through my website.
Can I ask just one question, which I don't know only because you spoke to a jury. Was it an all-male jury?
Yes, of course, women didn't go
I
on to a
didn't think
jury.
so, but I wouldn't
No,
touch
for
it.
some reason. But interestingly about the jury, all their names were listed, which is really extraordinary. You wouldn't get that today. But so the judge was able to name in his notes the juror who stood up. He said, I think it was Mr. So-and-so.
Well, we'd just like to invite you for a cup of tea and some cake next door and Vashti some of our other publications, and hope everyone continues the conversation. We'd really like to include your questions in our podcast, but if you don't want to be included, just let me know and we'll edit it out. But it makes the people who live in the regions feel really connected, and you ask such good questions and you give such great answers. So thank you.